Thanks for coming. I am certainly glad to see a lot of you here today. The focus is going to be more on New England timekeeping, and probably I won't be talking for too many minutes about Galileo and Italian monks in the 12th century. They're part of the story as well, but we're going to focus more on New England today. Oh, good, that's good, so we can see the slides here. Basically, I have a little over 100 images that we'll go through. I'll talk about them as they appear. And then, of course, I'm looking forward to examining the treasures that are over there. I'd say on that table we have at least $40 worth of clocks. So it should be exciting to look at those too. Folks always ask me where I got the name for my business, which is Bell Time Clocks. And back about 20 years ago, when I was thinking about a name for my business, I happened to buy a copy of the Winslow Homer engraving entitled Bell Time, which is an image of mill workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts. So I thought that was particularly appropriate. It was a good name for my business at the time. And it wasn't just by accident. Winslow Homer's brother or brother-in-law, I think, was an executive, a supervisor in the mills in Lawrence for a while. So Winslow Homer himself was familiar with the city, but at this time he was an illustrator, of course, for Harper's Weekly and other publications. He essentially was the equivalent of a news photographer today, but this is an image of Lawrence. But we can start talking more about the subject at hand too. Of course, this is the Mayflower, and I could pose the question, how many clocks were on the Mayflower? And you may have some idea, but the answer is 0. There were no clocks on the Mayflower. Clocks at that time were rare, unique, certainly not seagoing, and there were other ways of determining the time when you were at sea. Not all of them very good, but that's what had to do, including sand glasses. This happens to be a 4-hour sand glass, which corresponded with the watches on shipboard. If any of you have a Chelsea clock that rings the ship's bells, you know it goes in 4-hour cycles. So the sand glass could be turned over. The sand glasses also, at the one that the helmsman used, were half-hour, because that was the length of the period within the watches, and those would be turned over every half-hour. The problem was, if it was especially in the middle of the night and the helmsman was getting tired, he would turn the glass over before the sand was completely gone, and that was a problem called eating sand. And if they did that long enough, night and day would be reversed, and they'd be eating at the wrong time. So sand glasses weren't always the best means of determining the time. But they did have to know how they were, where they were at sea. And I was chatting a little bit earlier about the story of John Harrison and longitude. We won't be talking about that a lot again, since we're talking about New England timekeeping. But they had to know where they were at sea based on longitude and latitude. And of course, this is the famous Winslow Homer painting called 8 Bells, which you can go see in person at the Addison Gallery in Andover. But this shows the sighting. And of course, there is John Harrison, who probably at least some of you read the book or have seen the film called Longitude, about his developing a portable timepiece that was accurate enough to allow the determination of longitude at sea. So this is actually John Harrison holding H4, which was his 4th attempt, and finally the one that was successful enough to be practical, even though his ideas needed to still be simplified in a way that would make them mass producible. At the time of the Mayflower, there certainly were clocks, but they were somewhat primitive. They were certainly expensive. You had to be a member of royalty or extremely wealthy to own a clock. But this is an example, as you see, from 1600, which isn't far from the time of the Mayflower. And this particular clock, they believe, is Flemish. And of course, the Mayflower left from Holland. So we have a connection there where it's conceivable that some of the people on the Mayflower might have seen a clock like this and determined it. But again, they wouldn't have owned one, they wouldn't have taken one on shipboard. So it wasn't until the mid-1600s that we even had the development, the vital development, of pendulum clocks. Before that, the system was different with a thing called a foliot that clunked back and forth. And if you could get accuracy within many minutes a day or an hour a day even, you were lucky. But the invention of the pendulum, which applied a principle that Galileo did discover, although he never built it, ramped up the order of magnitude of accuracy for clocks on land that could have pendulums. by several orders of magnitude and made them accurate enough. But again, we're still talking 1660. The Pilgrims had already been in America for many years, and this was a very early, rare example of a pendulum clock, again, that they would not have had in the Plymouth colony. Even at the time of George Washington, clocks were not widespread, not widely owned. They were expensive, they were unique, they were pretty much built one at a time by craftsmen, so that most people like us in this room would not own a clock, would not be able to afford one, and we would count on other ways of knowing what time it was. As you can see, we have a clock from around the time of George Washington, but unlikely that this sat in a farmhouse in Topsfield. This was the type of ornate, this is called a bracket clock, ornate English clock, where if you had money, you had something like this, or you had maybe a long case clock of the time, but nothing inexpensive, nothing mass-produced. Of course, George Washington himself appeared on clocks. These were mostly French clocks. These are valuable now, but these appeared obviously after Washington's death, so that we started to see some of these, but again, not widely owned. The way that mostly we told time was with the sundial. This particular example was made by John Rowland in 1790. So if you set this up in your garden and you had it constructed for your latitude, you were able to, in the most accurate way possible at that time, know what time it was. It really wasn't until 100 years ago when we had any way besides a sundial or perhaps other types of astronomical observations to adjust the clock that was sitting on your mantle or standing in your foyer. There were obviously no GPS, no radio, no Walter Cronkite coming on. You had to use the sun, which is great when it's out, not so good at night, not so good when it's cloudy, but if it was set up right, you'd know, and as you traveled, you could consult the sundial that might be sitting in the garden as you were walking along. There certainly were public clocks as well. Here we have a view of State Street early in Boston history, and we see in that building there a public clock. And that was a sign of prestige. They existed earlier in Boston as well, in the late 1600s even. Every community that was up and coming, very soon they wanted not only a public building, but a public clock within it. So there would be subscriptions, and the community would join together to try to afford a public clock. The bell in the tower might be used for other purposes as well as announcing the hours. It might ring when the Indians were coming over the hill or the British were coming. Those bells were important for other reasons, but certainly for announcing the time as well. And certainly you could hear the bell a lot farther away than you could see the face of the clock. So the bell was perhaps more important than the dials of the clock at the time. So other communities too. Here's another, the old brick church in Boston. This was, in front of that was where the Boston Massacre took place. So there was a church, there was a clock in that tower as well. So that, and those clocks again were regulated by sundials. So you wanted to keep them pretty accurate, and pretty much they stayed together. But in big communities, especially in Europe, where many churches, many public buildings had clocks, there would probably be an hour's period of clocks ringing the hour because everybody was sure that their sundial was right, or maybe the guy setting the clock was sick that. So we see another 1830s scene inside here too. Here's our long case clock standing in the corner. I believe this painting also is in Boston. So you see in this case they're having a lot more fun. But it's part of the story too. It's great for any type of person interested in New England history, but of course I love it when I see a clock standing in the corner. Usually I can know something about it and know that that's what the clock looked like when it was there, not as an antique timepiece, but as part of the household, an important part. So again, 1814, a country wedding, and we're seeing our clock standing in the corner as well. Again, a happier scene than that first one by Robert Peckham. So, and even this more primitive one, you can see this one was sold at the Skinner auction house. So their name is there, but you can see our clock that hangs on the side there. So I have a lot of fun. I love going to art museums, finding art, and when I see one painting with a clock in it, it gets even more excited. And this actually is a clock maker, John Bailey, who is known. He worked in Hingham, Weymouth area, and this actually is a portrait of John Bailey. And this scene is New Bedford. And you say, okay, Bob, where's the clock in this picture? But there is one. And if you look long enough and hard enough down here, there's actually a trade sign, because that was a clock and watchmaker's shop there in this view of New Bedford. So you can see that he's got his sign outside the door. This, I believe, was the picture that was used on some of the posters for my talk today. Samuel Mulliken certainly was a local clockmaker as well. You see Newbury, that's Newbury, Massachusetts. So this is just a close-up of the dial. These white painted dials, if you may have noticed that the earlier clocks we saw by Gawain Brown and his contemporaries were brass dials. But around 1780 in Birmingham, England, a couple of guys, Wilson and Osborne, started factories making these white dials. They could mass-produce clock dials much less expensively than those brass and silver ones, and they were also much easier to see because, of course, there was no electric lighting then. The houses were dim, so it was hard to see the clock face, so at least if it was painted bright white with black numbers and black hands, you had a better chance of seeing it. And of course, this one also shows the phases of the moon. The lunar cycle is 29.5 days. So over here is the 29. There's usually a little half in there as well. And this rotates around. And this wasn't just for fun or for show, even though a lot of modern grandfather clocks have them today. If you go to Jordan's Furniture, some of those Howard Miller clocks will have a moon phase indicator as well. But people actually use them for fertility, for crop planting, for nighttime travel. The banjo clock, he patented it, and of course immediately everybody else started to make it too. The patent didn't help him too much, but it was a very innovative design for a number of reasons. It enclosed a smaller movement. Everything again was encased. It was an 8-day movement. A lot of other clocks had to be wound daily. This could be wound weekly, and it was quite accurate as well. There's the inside of a Simon Willard banjo clock. So we see our movement. The weight descends inside just like in a long case clock. Pendulum swings inside. But again, no striking, so everything can be very small because you aren't trying to accommodate two weights and a larger movement inside. This particular Simon Willard clock we saw, just so you get an example, this is the price tag that was with that clock at an antique show. If you happen to peek down at the bottom, you see that the one under your bed at home might have some value, so you might want to pull it out of there and at least dust it off. It doesn't mean that every old banjo clock is worth that. And in fact, this was from a high-end dealer who marks things up pretty aggressively. And you can buy a banjo clock as old as a Simon Willard for $1,000. So don't get carried away that every old banjo clock is extremely valuable. There were variations of banjo clocks. Some say that this girandole or girondole style is the most beautiful clock design ever made in America. Again, it's a version of a banjo clock designed and made by a fellow named Lemuel Curtis. So this clock would be $250,000 at least at auction because he didn't make many of them, and they were extremely beautiful and fancy. There are 2 of them at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, so you can see one there if you want. I'm not going to be talking a lot about watches. That's almost another whole story. But certainly watches were part of timekeeping in New England as well. Watches were expensive. They weren't mass-produced until much later when Waltham in the mid-1800s began developing the machinery that would allow you to mass-produce good watches. At that time, watches mostly came from Europe or were handmade here. The mass-produced watches, which were made in kind of a craft format, not in factories, came from Switzerland, and they were junk. So, we all think, no, Swiss watches, the epitome of accuracy and quality. Swiss watches were so bad, that's kind of why the American watch industry was able to get started. So, not all Swiss watches were great. But this is a style, this is an English watch, again, from about the time, the early 1800s that we're talking about. You can see that even women used larger watches. They didn't, of course, wear them on their wrist. Wristwatches didn't exist yet, but they could have them on a chain with a thing called a chatelaine, too, that sometimes had keys to the household as well as the watch dangling from her belt also. This is the inside of that watch. Again, it's an English watch. The English watches, perhaps as a carryover from Puritan days, were quite understated on the outside. Just a white dial, some hands. But inside, the watchmaker lets you know that he knew how to make stuff, and he could pierce and engrave and gild and everything too. And this isn't any royalty watch. This is basically a pretty standard watch of the time, made by this fellow Champion in Liverpool, England. And these watches are still pretty common. For a few $100s, you can own one. But the fun too is that often inside are watch papers, which indicate either who sold the watch or who serviced it later on. And the great thing about this watch, which is the reason that I bought it a few years ago at an auction, is because here we have New Ipswich, New Hampshire, as the location of the watchmaker who at some point worked on this watch and put his little paper inside the case. So, and that watchmaker again probably had some sort of trade sign like this hanging outside of his shop. Often there'd be a name on it, and similar to that sign we saw very tiny in that New Bedford image that I showed you. But the story starts to get more modern, more contemporary introduced by a fellow named Eli Terry. We're talking early 1800s. He was already a clockmaker at the time in Connecticut, but he was approached by...
Terryville.
Terryville is associated with Eli Terry, that's correct. So he was approached by these two businessmen, the Porters, who said, if you can mass produce 4,000 clocks in 3 years, which are actually the movements for long case clocks, we'll sign a contract. And everybody thought he was crazy because you just couldn't make clocks that much. But he had a concept of mass production, making clock movements out of wood. Because brass was expensive, the British controlled our supply of brass. We didn't have foundries here or stamping mills. So what did we have plenty of? Wood. So he had worked it out where he could mass produce the parts of clocks, and this really was the beginning not just of mass production of clocks, but of mass production, period, on the American system of factory production of interchangeable parts. People talk about the Springfield Armory where they made muskets with interchangeable parts, but still skilled people had to take those parts and file them and fit them so the musket would work. Pretty much with wooden works, clocks by Terry, the women mostly who were assembling these could pick a wheel out of the bucket of wheels and put it in the clock, and that clock would work. So it's a vital part of not just clock history, but American industrial history as well. So we see this is the tall case clock movement that he began mass producing. This is the type that the Porter brothers would have contracted him for. So the wheels were usually made out of cherry. The movement plates were made out of oak. The arbors often out of laurel wood. So they had to figure out the kinds of wood to use, because anybody who's worked with wood knows that it has grain. And obviously if the grain is running the wrong way, all these teeth will break off because the grain is going across the tooth, making it weak. Soon we needed a smaller clock than a long case clock, and the pillar and scroll clock was invented. Again, an American icon, a classic. There's still a lot of these around. They have wooden movements in them, but they also have these reverse painted glasses, very pretty ornamentation. So we're talking in the 1820s now, where the pillar and scroll clock came along. And even Terry made a stab at making a banjo clock too. There aren't many of these, but this is a wooden works banjo clock from the time with our reverse painting in the doors and all that. You don't see many of these, and sometimes antique people on the roadshow and all make a big deal about how rare something is. Things were usually rare for a reason, and sometimes that reason was nobody wanted them when they were new, so they didn't make many of them. And I think that's partly the case with this. This was not a good idea, and not many of them were made. So of course they're rare now, and collectors will go berserk, trying to find one. But rarity does not necessarily equate to quality. It's just something to keep in mind in the discussion of antiques. And of course, there was a clockmaker, very local, Daniel Pratt Jr., was in Reading, Mass. He bought his movements, his wooden works movements, from Connecticut makers. There's correspondence between them of arguing over how much stuff cost and where's my money and where's my movements. So we know that he was buying the movements but building the cases here in Reading, and on his big paper labels that were always inside the clocks, he even did us the favor of putting the date. So we know when Daniel Pratt clocks were made almost all the time. And there's a picture of Daniel Pratt looking kind of grumpy. I think he was already out of the clock business by then. His sons were running it in Boston. But there's Daniel Pratt later in life. Somebody equally important with Eli Terry was Chauncey Jerome. Some of you may have heard of Jerome clocks. He wrote a history of his experiences in the clock business. In fact, he even had a short-term partnership with P.T. Barnum, and they each accused each other of being duplicitous. My guess is that Barnum was the one that perhaps wasn't as straight as he should have been, judging by the rest of his business. But this is an interesting book about it. But Chauncey Jerome appeared at the time, or did the important work at a time in the 1830s when there was a severe economic recession in America, and there wasn't enough money around, and many, many businesses, including many, many clockmakers, went out of business. So something needed to be done to save the American clock business, and Chauncey Jerome, supposedly in a dream, thought of a way to make an inexpensive brassworks clock. Again, we were talking mostly any cheap clock had to be wooden works because brass was expensive. But there were starting to be brass mills, our own production of brass. So he developed this OG clock, and there's an example right over there on the table, because millions of these were made and still exist. And it was still weight driven. The weights descended inside the case. The pendulum swung inside, but it had a relatively inexpensive brassworks movement inside. And you can see this very large opening in the dial, and it's also on our clock that came in too, a large opening. Partly that was so we could see the clock ticking, but perhaps just as important is so your neighbors would know you didn't have one of those old-fashioned wooden works clocks. You had a brass works clock, and by God, you can see the brass right through the movement. So very typically, nice big hole there to see the movement inside. Here we see an advertisement for the Jerome's clocks and the various types that he made. Gothics, that's actually the name of steeple clocks, another one of those clocks that changed names over the time. Nobody called them steeple clocks when they were new. They were called Gothics or sharp Gothics. And he made many other types of clocks as well. As now finally clocks were inexpensive. Most people from farmers on up could afford clocks. They were sold by peddlers and eventually in stores and catalogs. So it was no longer a luxury item, but because of mass production and the impetus to compete and to produce in big quantities, virtually everybody could finally have a clock. Of course, you still needed somebody with a sundial to tell you what time it was, but if you could keep regulating your clock, you'd end up with it. And just because we're about on President's Day, we left New England for a minute, because we see Abe Lincoln here before he was elected president, and in Springfield, Illinois, is the clock that stood in Abe Lincoln's law office. And when that door opens, they point to a little smudged area on the side where Abe Lincoln's knuckle hit it every time he cranked the clock to wind it. So anyway, just as an aside, since we're at President's Day here. Henry David Thoreau, I like to throw him in when we're talking about New England clocks, because he both mentioned clocks in his talks as well as other things too. Here I have a book about Henry David Thoreau's possessions that was done by the Concord Museum in Concord, Mass. And this is a clock which hung in his house. He's talking, it's our belief that Thoreau referred to this when he talked about this clock ticking, and he even wrote about his mother's recollection of the clocks in 1857. She'd go out of the house in summer, she could hear nothing in the world but the ticking of the clock in the house behind her. And this, we believe, is the clock made in Concord. Concord, Mass. was a center of clock production until mass production really started to eat away at their ability to be competitive. But this was a clock made by Samuel Whiting in Concord, and most likely was known by Thoreau. But Thoreau also mentions in Walden that when he's in Walden, he can hear the train running by. He can hear it. So he's mixing his idyllic, more primitive lifestyle at Walden Pond with hearing the sounds of progress and of the train that's going by. So we see an early Boston locomotive. We see a nice Courier and Ives print that looks a lot like the kind of train that might have been passing Walden Pond in the distance when when Thoreau was there. And we also see what happens if timekeeping is not good enough on the train tracks. Most trains at the time were running on single track lines, and they needed to get off on sidings to let the train from Worcester go by the train that's coming from Worcester. And if they were using junky clocks or no clocks, often you would create a lot of expensive scrap metal on these train tracks. So timekeeping became an important part of the railroad industry, as well as just for telling time otherwise. We see this is Newton, Mass. We have a fellow checking the time here. This is just another great old stereo view photograph of a train station that's nearby. And we see a train schedule from the time too. In 1850, there certainly were a lot of trains running back and forth at various times. So you see how close the times are here. If you don't have a decent clock or a decent watch, you're going to have trouble, particularly because we were not yet on standard time. And I'll mention that again a little bit more in a minute. But these were local times. We even had local trolleys as well. You see this was the Haverhill line here, where these trolleys would go back and forth, but again needed us to know what time it was pretty well. So the clock companies in Connecticut started to produce what they claimed were more accurate clocks that could be portable. As we mentioned a minute ago with Harrison, he needed to develop a portable clock because you cannot have a pendulum swinging on a train or on a boat, and you cannot have weights hanging on a train or a boat. You need to contain it in something that ticks with what's called a balance wheel, an internal wheel oscillating rather than a pendulum swinging that can work in many positions and with many jostlings along the way. So companies like the Boston Clock Company, you can see specifically marketed these kinds of clocks, locomotive clock in this case, and the other companies were involved as well. Seth Thomas, brass lever clock for locomotives. They still were not as accurate as they needed to be, and we still had train wrecks at that time because of bad timekeeping. But now they're trying to get even attention. A chronometer lever, we call attention to this fine lever clock, locomotives, steamers. So, you know, as you can see, we're a pendulum clock to not be used. So they were marketing to that market of portable timekeeping that they at least hoped was going to be accurate enough. And lever clock refers to that balance wheel system rather than the pendulum. You can see we were up to $4.60 for some of these in this company. They were called marine clocks as well because, again, they could be used on boats as opposed to being in a case sitting on the ground that could have a pendulum. That particular company was the E. Ingram Company. It was Elias Ingram who thought up the concept of a steeple clock. And what allowed these smaller clocks finally to be made, this clock is way too small to have weights descending inside because we finally figured out how to make mainsprings inexpensively and competitively. Just before they were hand wrought by ironmongers and they would break a lot. But we finally figured out mass production of mainsprings so your clock could be much smaller and just have a spring or two springs inside you wound up. So it opened up many possibilities for smaller, even less expensive clocks that didn't have to have weights inside. So Ingram developed this again. No one called it a steeple clock. It was a sharp Gothic because of the interest in, the resurgent interest in Gothic architecture, Gothic design of the time. There is Elias Ingram looking very dapper and prosperous because he was. And an inside view of the clock factory at the time. So there was it was skilled work involved, but it still was mass production, allowing these clocks to be sold inexpensively. Yeah. And there's just an illustration of one of his trade catalogs, and a lot of these catalogs still exist, but fortunately they've been combined into nice books now. So that if you brought me an Ingram clock to repair or to sell, I could open up my big reproduction book of many Ingram catalogs and show you your clock and how it was described and sold when it was new. Another style is called the beehive clock. From that time period, again, we have, because we had mainsprings now, we could make smaller clocks. And the acorn clock, even more beautiful design, very fragile, so there's not many acorn clocks around anymore. But they're a beautiful design. But we also needed accurate timekeeping in the train stations and in other places like post offices and banks and courthouses. And Seth Thomas was making what were called regulators. The term regulator now doesn't have any meaning, and you can buy, at Sears, something from Korea that says regulator on it. But originally and still, to the experts, it means a very high accuracy clock. The highest form of regulator, called jeweler's regulators, and those would sit in watch and clockmakers' shops, and they would regulate the time of the other clocks and watches that they were working on. But many regulators were made earlier on for precision timekeeping in those settings I talked about, and Seth Thomas certainly was one of the makers. So here's an example of a Seth Thomas regulator from an original factory thing. The factory catalog. The astronomical regulators, again, were used in astronomical research, but also in places where, in laboratories, where very high accuracy was required. This one, maybe you can see for observatories, for watchmakers use, railway depots. So, and these were accurate to within, a portion of a second a month. We were at that level of accuracy. It's not just in the last 20 years with, transistors and chips that we can get accurate. They were doing it in a very sophisticated way. But the problem was, until the 1880s, that we did not have standard time in America. Every town had its own noon because, of course, the sun moves across the sky, and noon in Worcester is different than noon in Boston. And of course, it wreaked havoc on, once we started to move more than 3 miles an hour going places, and train schedules got horribly complicated. What time is it? Whose time is it? And you even had clocks like this, which showed the railroad time and the local time. And they were not close often. So you needed some form of standardization. And finally, in the 1880s, we were able to arrive at them. And here's an announcement at the time saying what you're supposed to do if you're a railroad employee or dealing with the railroads on Sunday, November 18th. Here's what the heck's going to happen now, so we're all on the same page as far as what time it is. But there were people that resisted this even decades afterward. It was interfering with God. God says, it's noon when the sun's on top of us. And there was a lot of resistance to the concept of standard time for a long time. As there is even now the resistance to daylight savings in certain places, and there are little pockets where people don't observe it. But finally, too, at the time of standard time, there were standards for accuracy in watches, because these were carried by train masters, and there had been a horrible train wreck in Kipton, Ohio, and finally, enough is enough. We've got to establish standards. We have to make accurate pocket watches and have a system of inspecting them and regulating them. And a fellow named Webb C. Ball was in charge of doing that, and they created standards for accuracy. And Waltham railroad grade watches, which is what this is, has a lot of joules, 23 joules, has an up indicator showing how much power is left in the mainspring, because you don't want to wreck your train because you forgot to wind your watch. And these railroad watches, you had to carry a paper with you indicating when it had been serviced, when it had been inspected. It was inspected every couple of weeks. It had to be accurate, or they took it right away and gave you a loaner. These cost as much as a car, sometimes they're extremely expensive, because they were not only manufactured to high precision in the Waltham and other factories, but they then went to the adjusting department, where the most skilled watchmakers in the factory would then take those watches and put them in cold boxes and hot boxes and test them up, down, sideways, over, under, and regulate them until they were as perfectly accurate as they could be in all environments. And of course, the other things needed to get timed too. This is one of my clocks and art pictures, because we've got a clock on the wall of this Courier and Ives print. But certainly people who were more of the sporting nature, they wanted to be able to time horse races too. And down below here is information, down to this, the percentage point second of the horse race. So many things were getting timed here in New England as well. But we also need to talk about things happening in the water too, because again, you couldn't have a pendulum clock on the local water. This is a picture of the steamship Merrimack going up the Merrimack River. There was a boat that ran on scheduled things from Newburyport up to the river up to Haverhill. So again, an old stereo view, but showing our steamer going along the Merrimack River, and also other scenes of coastal waterways here. Again, they weren't out of sight of land a lot, so they didn't have to worry about longitude and all. But they still, if they were running on a schedule, needed timekeeping. Some of you may know the name Rufus Porter. There are houses throughout New England that have these wall murals painted by Rufus Porter. There's a house in Andover that has them. So you get a sort of a stylized scene of what they thought was important, but also views of the time of important houses, events, and places. So you'll see the little steamboat there, and here's even a little close-up of that steamboat that was painted by Rufus Porter. He was also an important inventor. He was the founder of Scientific American magazine. He wasn't just some guy throwing paint on the wall. He had many other things. So here's the Boston Newport steamship company. There's our steamship going along, and you can bet they had schedules that they like to adhere to. Of course, sometimes things went wrong out there in the water too. Sometimes it was based on navigational problems, based on timekeeping. They were out of sight of land and they couldn't accurately determine their longitude. They might end up someplace where the water wasn't deep enough, and they would have problems. If they were in a coastal city like Boston, there was a time ball. This ball actually at noon, it would be raised up there and it would descend right at noon. So if you were setting your watch or your marine clock out on the water, you could see that time ball drop and you know it was exactly noon or exactly 1 o'clock. Sometimes they were done at 1 o'clock. But a very famous precision clockmaker in Boston named William Bond, he was in charge of the Harvard Observatory. They sold standard time. He was involved with standardizing railroad schedules, and he also made marine chronometers. This was the final outcome of John Harrison's work on finding longitude. Machines like this were made, which were very high accuracy marine timepieces that had to be accurate to a percentage of a second every month, or you might as well not have it. And they weren't perfectly accurate, but their inaccuracy was perfect. So once they were rated at the Kew Observatory in London or at the National Observatory in Washington, you would get a sheet, and I've seen them, for each chronometer saying, here's what it does over a week or a month's time as far as its losses and gains of time. So it didn't keep perfect time, but you factored in its inaccuracy, and you were able to determine your longitude if you were out of sight of land. This is, again, a stereo view old picture of the William Bond store in Boston. Up here is the address. So, and if only we could look a little more closely, if we could peer into that window, there's probably some great stuff in there for clock and watch enthusiasts to see in that window. I mentioned the Howard Clock Company. They were a major producer of commercial grade, high grade clocks in Boston. This is their Model 70 that was in every T station in Boston. Again, a good rugged clock that are worth money now because they were a high quality manufacturer. This is the catalog issue, view of it. They came in several sizes depending on how big a room you were in and how far it had to be. And they also made their version of a banjo clock. You can see it's not gold, it doesn't have an eagle on the top, it doesn't have fancy sidearms, but it has these distinctive Howard black, red, and gold glasses which pretty much tell you that you're looking at a Howard banjo clock. And these were used again in courthouses and accounting firms. You know, a lot of old pictures you see of places where people were doing important work. There'd be a Howard banjo clock ticking away on the wall. And those also came in 5 sizes. This is again a catalog showing they went from the normal number 5, which is mostly what we see, all the way down here to the number 1, which is probably about as tall as I am. So they were big. And there's a view of the Howard Watch Factory in Boston. Sadly, that building's not there anymore on Tremont Street, but they were in business a long time, doing a lot of important work. There's a copy of one of their 1889 catalogs from that company. And there were mechanics fairs in Boston where crafts types of industries would display their products. And this again is an old stereo view showing the display that the Howard Clock Company put on at the time. We see their astronomical regulators. Now, I love these kinds of things because, you know, we get in the mindset, oh yeah, look at that whole picture full of antique clocks. Now, these clocks were brand new. You know, this wasn't any antique show. This was a trade show. This is like going to the car show in Detroit. You know, this is the new clocks at the time that they were hoping you would order from the factory. But of course, it's very exciting to Howard collectors now. One of these astronomical regulators is a very distinct, unique style, and that very clock sold a couple of years ago at Skinner to a guy in Texas, and he's thrilled to have this picture showing his clock when they were trying to sell it. And they weren't inexpensive. And again, at Howard 70, but you can see they marketed to many places like the U.S. Lighthouse Service. So these clocks were in lighthouses as well, which of course were also important for helping to keep ships from ending up on the bottom. And then just we have a little view of the Howard movement inside that Howard 70. Looks a lot like that banjo clock movement we saw before. Basically, you've just got wheels, the power's provided by the weight, which hangs down, provides the power, which goes down basically through a transmission, is stepped down from a lot of power hanging there to just enough through a series of wheels and pinions, the small gears, to swing the pendulum. If your clock stops, it's not because the weight is pulled up too high or your clock is not overwound. There's no such thing as a clock or watch being overwound unless you put a pipe wrench on there and break the key off. If a clock doesn't work, it's because all these little bearings and all eventually get worn and clogged with old oil and dirt and dust, and the wheels just can't turn freely anymore. And that's how I stay in business, is by taking them apart and cleaning and repairing those types of movements. But here you can see basically what's happening inside there in the simplest form. There were also clocks on the street. These street clocks, there's one made by Howard, and you may remember some of these are around. There used to be many more of them on towns and the streets. But you know, the backing up garbage truck and the out of control drunk driver, you know, they end up, a lot of these get knocked down and they don't get put back up again. So we're fortunate for the people that have restored them or protected them so they exist. Here's the Seth Thomas Company also made street clocks. You can see they made two dial and 4 dial versions of them too, sign of prestige. And they were even used for advertising, because you can see this dining room here on Brattle Street in Boston, the big clock in front of our dining rooms. So it became a landmark, a way for people to be able to not only tell the time, but to find the place they want to eat at. And of course, there are still old buildings with old clocks in them. We're seeing Boston, the old building here, of course, surrounded by much larger, bigger ones, but it remains there with the clock. And my final image, we suddenly shot back about 500 years, because, again, one of my clocks in art images, but this, there was a notion at the beginning of mechanical timekeeping, the notion of the wisdom clock, where clock was really viewed almost as a metaphor for God and for regulating life and for discipline and for, you know, this modern thing, but it encompassed a life in a way. Once you wound the clock up, it started to tick and created, almost had a life of its own. So the notion of a wisdom clock was one that was early on and was carried through in illustrations like this, where these are certainly old clock mechanisms, but certainly religious connotations as well as cultural and mechanical. So setting up, and she was carrying her OG clock with her. Of course, now we already know what the OG clock is. It was certainly one of the most important inventions of the time, because it allowed inexpensive brass clocks to be made. And by the way, these were the first time we were exporting clocks to Europe. The wooden works clocks didn't work well in boats. So, you know, the humidity and everything would mean usually the wooden movements wouldn't work when they got there. So for the first time brassworks clocks, we could export them. So Chauncey Jerome sent a boatload of OG clocks over to England, and they had anti-dumping legislation. They didn't want their clock industry to get undersold and wiped out by anybody in another country. And the way that they handled things, you can unload that from you so we don't have an accident.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Sorry.
That's okay. So we have this boatload of OG clocks arrives in port in England, and the way the English handled this, if they thought you were selling below cost, they would buy the whole boatload, essentially to put you out of business, because you had to be losing money. So he gets there, he says, yeah, these clocks are $3.50 each. Oh, sure they are. They bought the whole boatload for $3.50. Jerome pays $2.50 each to make them. So he rushes in another boatload. They buy that. By the third boatload, they say, all right, maybe you're not dumping. And there's a lot of OG clocks in England for that reason, because they were imported for a long time. And the British clock industry at the time was kind of hidebound in making clocks the old way, meaning clocks were very expensive if they were made in England. So a lot of people suddenly in England could own clocks, even if they were made by the Yanks. They were able to have a clock. OG clocks, again, are quite common. If this clock in this condition, it's got its label in here, the veneer's in pretty nice shape, the dial's in nice shape, the movement looks kind of dark, so that would have to be serviced. But again, they're plentiful, so this would be $100 to $200 at that auction probably. Again, if we're lucky, because antiques of all kinds have depreciated a lot in the current economic situation. Some clocks have gone down by half from what they brought at the peak of their value maybe 7 or 8 years ago. But still, OG clocks are still so plentiful. And occasionally I would sell one really spiffed up in nice condition for a few $100s, but I'm not sure I could do that anymore. Again, weight driven, so we need to have the weights and all to make this work. But I've serviced many of these and the people are very happy to run them. These are, of course, 30-hour clocks, so if you run this consistently, this requires daily winding. And in the old days, that was fine. You know, that's one thing Dad did or Mom did in the morning. They got up, they lit the stove, they wound the clock. It was part of their routine. Now, you know, we might balk at having to do that. Since this just came along, I'll hold this up too. It's, the banjo clock was such an iconic design that companies made them for up until the present time. This is a fairly contemporary Seth Thomas clock. It's probably, in fact, sometimes there's a date in there. Yeah, this was made in 1968. It says 6803. And Seth Thomas continued to do that where they would date their clock. So this is a 1968 clock. Still has a mechanical movement in it. We haven't quite gotten to reliable battery movements, and plug-in clocks sometimes are more expensive than a mechanical movement. Again, this would be like a $30 or $40 clock if it came up at auction, if anybody would even bid on it. So that's, they're again very plentiful. There's a lot of them in the world. Okay, we're moving down the line here. Wall clock. This is a called an Ionic style, and I believe I see a label in here. Yep, they weren't shy about telling you who made the clocks, and you know, there's things in here about how to regulate them, how to take care of them, and how they're the finest clocks in the world always. You know, it says it right on the label, so it must be true. This is E. Ingram. Remember, we saw the Dapper Gentleman. This was his company, and this would be an 8-day clock. But how many winding holes do we see here? One. This is a timepiece. This does not strike the hours because you would need 2 winding holes to have a time and strike movement in here. So right away, virtually all the time, you see 1 winding hole, it's a timepiece, it doesn't strike, it just tells the time. And a lot of times, these kinds of wall clocks were not strikers because they hung in schools or places where you don't want the clock banging away all the time. You just want something that shows the time from a distance. So this has a nice glass here too. You look to see if the glass looks original, if the finish and the case looks original. This finish looks a little too good to be the original, but it's still kind of an old finish. But this would be a $200 or $300 clock probably at one of my auctions. You know, I like these, and if I can, I get them and sell them to people that just want that kind of look, even though it's not quite as common as the octagon top school clocks that we see more frequently. This is one of a couple of black mantle clocks we have here, but I'm glad we have the other end of the spectrum in a way too, because this is an American one. And let's see if there's the remainder. Yeah, I believe this says Waterbury, because Waterbury Clock Company in Waterbury, Connecticut was one of the giant Connecticut clock-making companies. And all of those companies made these black mantle clocks. Essentially, they were simulating black marble clocks that came from France. But so it was a style that was important, and people were aware of it. But if you wanted to make one inexpensively, you would make it out of wood and either paint it with a very glossy black enamel paint, or put on what Seth Thomas did, a surface called adamantine, which was an early kind of plastic almost, or celluloid veneer that looked like marble or looked like a fancy wood. In this case, though, that was only Seth Thomas. In this case, Waterbury would have just this black paint on here. And this pattern in here would have been golder originally. We have some marbleizing here. We were trying to make it look like marble columns. So, and these are very plentiful. This might be a $50 clock, you know, $75 clock. And you notice I'm not spending a lot of time on, you know, does it work, does it not work? It almost doesn't matter. As long as the movement is in there, that's pretty much what you're thinking about, unless you're the end-use retail buyer who, you know, is buying it from me and wants it to run. If you're just, you know, selling this to a dealer or finding out what it's worth, whether it works makes absolutely no difference, as long as all the parts are there. Because if it doesn't work, it's because, like every clock, it's gotten worked, it's gotten dry, dirty, worn, and just needs somebody like me to fix it. Because even if they tell you it works, it might have a month to go till it doesn't work. So you're probably better off if it doesn't work. Then at least you know you have to fix it. The other end of the spectrum is this is an actual French black marble clock. They're called black marble clocks, but it's really not marble, it's slate, which was blackened through a fuming process, an acidic fuming process. So if you decide, I'm really going to shine this baby up, and you start rubbing this real hard, you get down to a gray stone underneath, and you've ruined your clock. So don't go crazy with your buffing wheels trying to brighten these up. But this is stone, this is heavy. There's a typical round French movement inside. At the time, these clocks probably cost 5 to 10 times more than the comparable American black mantle clocks in wooden cases. But we're now at a time in the supply and demand of antiques where this is old-fashioned. This is often a Victorian kind of look. Even though this was a quality clock at the time, these still only bring $100, $150 now, and they're tough to sell because, you know, it's just not the kind of thing that people who are decorating now necessarily want. So the quality is very high. You look at things like the porcelain dial. Does it have cracks, any chips? This one doesn't. Is the beveled glass in nice shape? Yes, it is. You know, everything looks great. So it was a quality, valuable clock when it was new. It still has the quality, but the value isn't there just because the demand isn't there. So it's, and you also need to check the sides to see if the maid has knocked it off the mantle ever, and you had to glue it back together. And the other thing you see them trying to hold it from the bottom, because these cases are just kind of plastered together, and too many times people lift it from up here, and it separates, and your toe is broken, and the case is in pieces. So you want to try to pick these up from the bottom if you can. We're looking at this is a Louis XVI type of clock. Again, these were originally French, originally gold-plated, you know, very fancy, big, expensive. But the Americans also wanted to make clocks that looked expensive and they could make money for. And this happens to be made by the Ansonia Clock Company, another one of the big Connecticut clock-making companies. I see their insignia here on the logo. We have a nice plaque here too. This probably had, you know, like 2 microns of gold plating on it too at some point, and the old finish still looks pretty good. A lot of times, you know, Uncle Ernie decides to get out the gold radiator paint and make them really look good. And at that point, the value doesn't maintain. But it was an expensive clock when it was new too. We have looks like we have a break down there, which just sometimes happens from the casting process was not too good to begin with. But this would be, again, maybe you know, $150 to $250 clock at an auction, just because of it's still pretty, it's heavy, it's conditioned. The real French ones actually had ormolu finish, and some of you may know that that was a process of gold plating that combined gold with mercury. So you smear it on there and put it in an oven to heat it up, and the mercury would vaporize away, leaving a beautiful coating of gold on the case and kill everybody downstream. So no one does ormolu anymore because you're making an awful lot of mercury vapor, which is bad stuff. And a lot of people who did ormolu work went crazy from the nerve damage of breathing in a lot of mercury. So the Americans weren't doing ormolu process. It was mostly in France. These are called gingerbread clocks, or kitchen clocks sometimes. And again, I don't have to be a genius and remember what this is, because sure enough on the back, this is the Citizen number 20. I guess I could have stood here and said, yeah, this is the Citizen number 20, and sounded really smart. But this is by William Gilbert. That's good. We're getting a nice cross-section of the major Connecticut manufacturers, because here's yet another of the big companies called, and this was William Gilbert. A lot of the William Gilbert clocks, especially wall clocks on the face, say William Gilbert, I think like 1807. And by God, it's the hardest thing for me to convince people that their clock is not from 1807. That's the year he was born. So but they want to believe that the date's right on the clock. So I know the clock's that old. But when he was born, he was not making clocks. It took him a while to learn how. But we also see a nice dealer label on the back, which I like to see too. And we know that this clock, at some point in its life, was in Kewanee, Illinois. And being serviced or sold, oh no, I'm sorry, we know. This clock was repaired by G.W. Giles Jeweler in Kewanee, Illinois. So we know more of the clock story now, that at some point in its life it went there, or even when it was new. These kinds of clocks often were sold as sets to jewelers, where they would buy 10 of them in a crate and then retail them out of their own shops. And it also was a time when we were getting more and more mechanized. We had the ability with scroll saws and heat presses and stampers to put in these fancy patterns. You know, I've had people bring me these clocks and say, yeah, this thing was hand carved. Yeah. You know, and nobody carved this. This was done by a machine that went boom, you know, with a lot of steam and pressure and made this pattern on here. Nobody carved it. But still, it's pretty, and they were certainly inventive in figuring out how to make things like this fancy, but still so you could afford it. This clock probably cost $4 when it was new, which was a lot, but not out of reach. And now it's worth more than $4, but maybe only 10 times $4. Because again, they're plentiful, and even though they were important things, who wants them now, and who, you know, the number of people interested in old clocks is going down as many antique interests are going down. So, you know, for lucky $40 or $80, you know, kind of in that range, this might sell. It looks like it has its original paper dial. A lot of these had paper dials, which deteriorate over time. And you can buy replacement paper dials, but it's obvious then that it is a replacement dial, and that can affect its value as well. All right, moving along. This dial is called a Venetian. No label on the back, so I can't act as smart as I did with the other one. But let's take a peek inside here. Oh good, there's a label inside, so I'm off the hook here too. Another Ingram, that dapper gent strikes again. This dial is definitely a replaced dial, because I can just tell because the paper is shiny and glossy and it doesn't say the name on it. So at some point the dial just got too ratty looking, and whoever had it serviced put a new paper dial on there. We still retain our original label inside, which is nice. This is the original reverse painted glass. It's called that because the paint's on the inside, so you don't wipe the paint away every time you clean the glass, and it gives it more of a shine and a luster if it's painted inside. So that's been here, but I'd say we've lost maybe 20% of the paint on that glass. And it was a pretty glass, but not great to begin with. And this clock has also, you know, got some losses up here. This originally was gilded also. That could be old gilt. It sort of looks like that. But again, not particularly valuable. And this is a 30-hour clock. Usually you can tell because a big movement that you wind once a week has more wheels, it's bigger, and the winding holes would be lower down. So I just know from experience that when the winding holes are up this high, it's a smaller movement which requires daily winding. So again, that's also a problem with its value. If you're trying to sell this to somebody who's 30 and just bought an old house, when they hear you got to wind it every day, sometimes that's a stop. So in this condition, this clock still is under $100. So, all right, we're making progress, almost to the end here. And we have another round top mantel clock, similar to that Phoenician style, but just not quite as fancy. And often these were called whatever the style was, and then VP, which stood for visible pendulum, because the whole door is glass, and probably the pendulum is fairly fancy, and it would swing down below. I see a paper in there, so maybe I'm going to be able to cheat and know who made this without having to pull the dial off. It looks like our paper dial is original because it's nice and yellow, and or maybe not nice and yellow, but yellow and flaking a little bit. No, this is just the owner's name inside. So this, in this case, because we don't have the label. Oh no, there's an old label here. I'm sorry. Another Ingram. All right. It looks like Ingram sold a lot of clocks in Topsfield. So we can look at the glass too. That's something that if you get the right angle, you see it's wavy glass, and this putty looks old. So the odds are very good that this was the original glass, which can make a difference, especially if the glass has some pattern on it. That would be more important than clear, but you can see that it's wavy and bubbly a little bit in the old putties there. So this would have it. But we're still, you know, if this were a $100 clock, we'd be lucky. So, are we up to 1,000 yet on this table? I'm not sure. All right. I guess I see a couple there, but just for this table, I'll save the worst for last. And this is a reproduction. It's Korean. It says 31 day here because this is a monthly wind clock. And you know, it's a great idea. You don't have to wind your clock as often as you did before. But the problem is, in order to make it run for a month, it has some heavy-duty mainsprings in there that run the clock all that time. And sometimes the thing holding that mainspring isn't that good. So you're winding it up a little tired, maybe on Sunday morning, and suddenly the thing calls the click that keeps the clock from unwinding when you wind it. That fails, and that key turns into a lawnmower and tears your fingers up, and you get so startled sometimes you knock the clock off the wall. So these can be problematic, but you know, for a time, this is really